Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Brittany of BrittanyJJones.com. In today's video, we are going to be sewing. We're going to be sewing along to McCall's 8530, and I'll be making view C on this pattern. Let's get started. Again, we're going to be sewing along to McCall's 8530, and I'll be sewing view C on this pattern. For fabric, I am using a crepe back satin. This is the fabric here that I will be using. And for lace, I have two different types of lace. I do think that I could have probably just cut the larger lace to be the size of the smaller lace that goes around the neckline and the sleeves, but I went ahead and purchased two. And for the ribbon, this here is the ribbon that I will be using. This here goes along the sleeves. So again, this is the one that I have for this project. To begin, the first thing that we're going to do is stay stitching. Stay stitching for this project is done at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I did mine at about 1/4 of an inch, but again, it's 1/8 of an inch for this project, and it is important to make sure that you do your stay stitching in the right direction so you can refer to the pattern illustrations to see how you should apply the stay stitching. Once you have that done with right sides facing, we are going to pin and stitch the shoulders together. So again, make sure that you have it right sides facing. Match up your notch that's on the shoulder seams and pin in place. Once you have both of them pinned, we can go ahead and stitch in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that the shoulder seams are sewn, you can see here I finished mine off with my serger. The next thing that we're going to do is grab the lace that we're going to be applying along the neck edge. As you can see, I've started to trim away the portion of the lace that's just kind of holding everything together. For me, it's kind of creating a little bit of a gathering effect on the lace, and I just need it to be nice and straight. So I'm just trimming off that little portion just so I can have nice and straight lace that I can work with without it having kind of that gathering effect on it. Okay, now that I've done that, I am going to take a pin and I'm going to place a mark on both of the front edges 1.5 inches away from the lower edge of the bottom. So as you can see here, I'm just placing a pin. That's just going to be a mark so that we can begin to taper the lace down to nothing. So again, 1.25 inches up from the hem, I'm just placing some pins there as a mark. And now I'm going to begin pinning the lace, the straight edge of the lace along the neck edge, and I am pinning it 1/4 of an inch away from the raw edge. So the lace is 1/4 of an inch away from the neck edge, as you can see here. Just continue pinning that all the way along the neckline like so. Once you have it all pinned in place, it should look like this. And again, down here at this mark, you can see I started to taper the lace down because we want it to taper in. I'm just showing you the example on the instructions, how we want it to taper almost to nothing. There are also some great tips for working with lace here on the instructions as well that I did want to point out. Now that we have it pinned, let's baste in place. All right, now that the lace is basted on, you want to go ahead and trim the edges even with the front. So once we did that little taper, you may have some excess that's not even with the front. We can go ahead and trim all of that off now. I'm noticing right now, I wish I would have aligned the lace a little bit better so that it matches up along the front. So definitely make sure on your top that you kind of pay attention to that detail. You can see here that mine is a little bit off, so I do just want to mention that so you can take time just to make sure that yours will match up once you have it all installed. But now let's go ahead and move on to the next step. Next, we're going to start working on our facing pieces, pattern piece number 3 and 4. You should have applied interfacing to these pieces. And so with right sides facing, you want to match up the notches and pin those shoulder seams together along the facing pieces like I'm doing here. Once you have them pinned, we can go ahead and stitch them in place using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then you want to finish off the outer edge of your facing with your serger or whatever method you're using to finish off your seams. Let's do that now. Now that we have the facing sewn together and we have finished off the outer edges with our serger, again, you may have used another type of finishing method, maybe bias tape, Whatever you've used, let's go ahead and apply the facing onto the neckline edge. You want to match up your notches, match up your dots, and go ahead and start to pin in place. Once you have it pinned, we can go ahead and stitch in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that I have the facing attached, I'm going to go ahead and trim down my seam, and I'm also going to clip into my curves. So I'm just going to use my rotary cutter just to quickly trim it off. You can use your shears if you'd like, but again, go ahead and trim down your seams and clip into your curves. After you have it all trimmed, then you want to go ahead and do some understitching. With understitching, you want to make sure that you have your seam allowance facing toward your facing, and we're going to stitch really close to that seam. That is just going to help everything lay nice and neat inside the garment. Now that the understitching is complete, and now we can go ahead and secure the bottom edge of the facing. You just want to do a basting stitch to keep that in place. So we can go ahead and apply again a basting stitch, and we can also hand tack the facing to the seam allowance. That's going to keep it from rolling out. There's two ways to do it. You can do it by sewing machine and stitch in the ditch, or again, you can just do it by hand to quickly tack down the facing to the seam allowance. Okay, I've gone ahead and done my basting stitch along the lower edge of the facing. I also went ahead and tacked down the facing to the seam allowance. Again, that's just going to help prevent it from rolling out. So you go ahead and do yours, and you also want to do some gathering stitches between the notches along the lower edge of the front. For gather stitches, you want to lengthen out your stitch length to the longest stitch on your machine. Definitely refer to your machine manual if you're not quite sure how to do that. The next thing for us to do is to bring the bottom of the bodice together at the center front, and matching up that large circle, you want to do a tack right there just to temporarily hold it together. Now that we have the tack done, this is what mine look like here. I actually did mine on the machine. I just dropped my feed dogs and did a zigzag stitch. The next step for us to do is to apply stay stitching along pattern piece number 5. And again, remember that stay stitching is done at an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance for this project. Once you have the stay stitching complete, we can go ahead and pin it onto the bodice. So I'm just going to flip it right sides facing. I'm going to begin matching up the circles as well as the notches. You will need to pull on those gathering stitches to match those up. So again, just go ahead and begin to pin the bodice to the front, pulling on those gathering stitches, matching up your notches, and let's get it pinned. Now that we have it pinned, we can stitch using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And once you get to that center circle, you do want to kind of pivot just to make sure you keep that seam kind of angled. Make sure that you pivot at that circle when stitching. Let's do that now. All right, now that we have our seam sewn, this is what mine looks like here. Go ahead and give everything a good press. And I also finished off the seam with my serger. So here's a look at the inside of what mines look like as well. Now that we have that sewn, the next thing for us to do is start to work on pattern piece number 6. And we need to get our larger lace for this. I'm going to fold the lace, making sure that I match up the scalloped edge at the top and bottom of the lace. And you also want to add an additional 1 inch to pattern piece number 6. That's going to account for the seam allowance on each side. So again, make sure that you add an inch to both sides of pattern piece number 6. So as you can see here, I have my ruler and I'm just adding an inch and trimming away to both sides of pattern piece number 6. If you're wondering why we're adding an extra inch to both sides of this pattern piece, is to account for any changes in the fabric due to it being cut on the bias. So once you have it cut, you want to go ahead and pin the center front seam together, and let's go ahead and stitch in place. Once you have it stitched, go ahead and trim down your seam like I'm doing here. And now we can go ahead and get ready to apply it onto the top. Your lace should look similar to this. Now let's grab the top. So on the outside, we are going to pin the lace to the front. Make sure that you match up the center front. And we're going to be placing the inner corners of the lace on the upper edge along the seam. I'm going to say that again because it may be a little confusing. So on the inner corners of your lace detail, we are going to be placing that right along the edge of that seam that we've already sewn. So as you can see here, I'm going to do a close-up so you all can get a better look. But right at the inner corners of the lace design, I am making sure that I put those corners right along my seam. So again, you can see at every kind of roundness at the top of the lace, I'm making sure that inner corner of that design of the lace is right along the upper edge of my seam. So that is what we are looking to make sure that we stitch. I've decided I'm going to baste mine in place first, making sure that I have that corner right along my seam before I start sewing. You can choose to do this, or you can just stitch it in place, totally optional, but I just felt more comfortable having it basted down before I stitch it in place. Again, the inner corner of the lace is going to the upper edge of the seam. That is what we are doing here. Go ahead and do yours the same way, have everything pinned in place, and then we can prepare to stitch it. Okay, once you have the upper edge of it sewn like so, we're going to do the same exact thing for the lower edge. So go ahead and pin through those inner corners along the lace for the lower edge and stitch it the same exact way. Once you have your lace secured, let's install the zipper. The first thing that I did was I went ahead and finished off my side seams where I'm going to be installing the zipper at. And the second thing to note is that this zipper is sewn upside down in the left side seam. So it opens from the hem up. So it's important to make sure that you have your zipper in the right direction before you install it. If you do not have the markings transferred onto your garment, make sure that you transfer those circles. Those are just going to help us to know where we need to stop with our stitching for the zipper. And if your zipper is long like mine, that's totally fine. We can trim off the excess later. To begin, I am going to be placing the zipper, making sure I have it face down. And I am going to have the coils along the seam line, and I'm going to begin pinning in place. Again, make sure that you have your coils of the zipper along the seam line, 5/8 of an inch seam line. Make sure that the tape is within the seam allowance, and go ahead and pin it in place. Make sure that you match up that zipper stop with that marking, that circle you transferred, and just begin to pin it in place. Once you have it pinned, you can go ahead and baste it in place if you like. You can baste it by machine or by hand. As you can see here, I have it all pinned. I'm going to baste it in place first, and then I'm going to go back over it with a regular stitch, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch it in place. I am going to be using an invisible zipper foot, but you can use a regular zipper foot to install your invisible zipper. Let's go ahead and stitch one side now. Here is a look at my invisible zipper foot. It has a nice groove on the back side of the foot. It makes it really easy to install zippers. Now that we have one side of the zipper tape sewn on, I'm gonna just zip the other side down, just closing up the zipper, because you want to make sure that you match everything up. I like to pin my zippers to make sure everything is even, as opposed to just stitching down the side, assuming that I have it. So I do recommend just taking time, make sure that everything lines up, and then go ahead and pin the remaining of the zipper tape in place the same exact way that we did to the other side, making sure that you match up your circles and that you have your zipper coils along the seam line, your 5/8 of an inch seam line, and then just continue pinning the zipper tape in place. Once your zipper is installed, you can go ahead and zip it up and take a look and make sure everything is nice and clean. If not, this is the time where we can unpick some stitches and make some changes if need be. But if it looks nice, you're happy with it, now we can go ahead and if you have a long zipper tape, we can shorten it. To shorten it, you can either get a needle and thread and go over the coils to make a new zipper stop, or you can do it by machine. As you can see, I did mine by machine. I dropped my feed dog and then I did a zigzag stitch to create a new zipper stop. Once I had the new zipper stop created, I went ahead and trimmed off the excess zipper with my pinking shears. You can also use a scrap piece of fabric to just cover up the end of the zipper to give it a really nice finish as well. The next thing for us to do is to close up the remaining part of that seam that's right up under the underarm. I always stitch to the left of my zipper tape and I get really close to where I started the stitch at and then continue closing up the rest of the seam. Okay, now that I have the remaining part of that seam sewn, this is what that side seam looks like, the left side seam where we have installed the zipper. And again, the zipper should be unzipping from the bottom coming up. So make sure that you do have it installed properly. Once you have this side of the top done, now we can go ahead and sew the other side seam. So with right sides facing, you want to go ahead and put the remaining side seam together and you can go ahead and pin in place. Once you have it pinned, we are going to stitch this in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then you can press your seam open flat. Now that I have this side seam sewn, this is what that looks like on the outside, and this is what the inside looks like. I just need to press my seam open. Now we can go ahead and kind of finish up this side where the zipper is. If your zipper tape is not tacked down, you can go ahead and tack that down just so that it's not flapping around. You do want it to be secured because we are going to start creating our narrow hem. For the narrow hem, you do want to fold up 5/8 of an inch, and then you want to fold in that raw edge into the crease, and then we'll baste it in place. So again, you want to fold up 5/8 of an inch. We're going to do that along the zipper as well. So you want to fold up 5/8 of an inch and press that. Open out, you'll have a crease. Fold in the raw edge to meet the crease and then fold again to create your narrow hem. And then we will baste it in place. I just wanted to show you how I am pressing this in place at my ironing board. So as you can see, I pressed up the 5/8 of an inch narrow hem, and then I'm just folding in the raw edge to that crease, and I'm using my pins to help hold the fabric in place because it's really slippery. So just do what you have to do to create your narrow hem. This is what I'm doing, and then we can baste it in place. This is what my hem looks like. Yours should look similar to this. If you did a basting stitch, perfect. We're going to do a regular machine stitch when we apply the lace to it. I actually mistakenly did a regular stitch here, but again, we have to apply lace over top. Right now, I'm just kind of looking at this opening edge. Make sure that you have your stitches meet up nicely at that zipper point. And I am going to actually tack this down a little bit with the seam allowance so the zipper seam allowance isn't flapping underneath the top. That's just something extra I'm doing. But once you have your top like this, we can start working on the sleeves. For the sleeves, we need to go ahead and grab our ribbon. For the ribbon, we need to cut two pieces that is 31 inches long. We're going to fold the ribbon in half, and then along that folded edge, we are going to baste a stitch that is a scant 5/8 of an inch. So it's barely 5/8 of an inch, a basting stitch that we're going to do on the folded edge. Once we have that done, we can go ahead and apply 2 rows of ease stitching along our sleeve at the top. You should have transferred some circles on your sleeves. We're going to be applying the ease stitching between those circles like you see here. And the ease stitching is just like gathering stitches. You just want 2 rows of them. After you have those applied, we are going to baste the ribbon onto the circle that we transferred along the lower edge of the sleeve. So again, put your ease stitching in, baste on your ribbon, then we're going to fold the sleeve in half and we're going to stitch down the sleeve seam. Let's do that all now. All right, once you have your sleeve sewn, it should look like this. I went ahead and finished off the seam with my serger. And again, you should have your ribbon sewn in as well. The next step for us to do is to go ahead and measure the lower edge of the sleeve and cut a piece of lace, the same lace that you used along the neckline. You're going to apply it to the lower edge of the sleeve. But to get that measurement, you need to measure the lower edge of the sleeve, and then you want to add 1.25 inches to that measurement. Once you have that cut, then you want to stitch the ends at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So again, cut a piece of lace the width of the lower edge of the sleeve and add 1.25 inches to that measurement. And then you're going to stitch it together at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have that stitched, then you can pin the straight edge of the lace a 1/2 inch away from the lower edge of the hem. I know that's a lot, so I'm going to repeat it. But first, I actually cut my lace a little bit too long. That's what you can see me doing. So I just had to go back and shorten it a little bit. And so now that it's shortened, I can go ahead and match up that seam, and I can continue pinning the straight edge of the lace a 1/2 inch away from the lower edge of the hem of the sleeve. So again, make sure that it's a 1/2 inch away from the lower edge, the straight edge of the lace, and then just continue pinning the lace all the way along the lower edge of the sleeve like I'm doing here. Once you have one sleeve complete, you can go ahead and do the same thing to the other sleeve, and then we can stitch close to the straight edge of the lace. Now that we have the lace stitched on, the next thing for us to do is to create a narrow hem along the edge of our sleeve. We're going to do that the same exact way that we did for the lower edge of the top. You want to fold up 5/8 of an inch, give that a press, open out that crease, and then fold in that raw edge. Fold it over again to create a narrow hem. It's going to be kind of challenging with the lace here, but just take your time and do the best that you can do. And once you have your narrow hem created, you can go ahead and create a basting stitch. Once it's basted, go ahead and top stitch it. This is what mine looks like now with the top stitch. So now let's go ahead and install the sleeve. You want to first match up your side seam with the underarm seam of your sleeve. Go ahead and match that up, pin there, and then you can start to match up the notches along your sleeve and pin that in place. Make sure that the double notch matches up with the back and the single notch matches up with the single notch along the front. Pull up those gathers and ease everything in so that you can install your sleeve. So as you can see here, I'm just pulling my sleeve through. You should have transferred a circle at the top of your sleeve cap that matches up to the shoulder seam, and then just continue pinning your sleeve in like I'm doing here. Go ahead and install your other sleeve, pin it in place the same way, and then we can stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, I have both of my sleeves sewn in. Yours should look similar to this. I did go ahead and finish off my sleeve seam with my serger, and you want to make sure that you don't have any folds or any pulls along your sleeve. Make sure that that seam matches up. And once you have your both of your sleeves installed, now we can go ahead and move on to the last step, and that's going to be attaching the lace along the hem of our top. So the same lace that we applied along the waist, we're going to get that same lace and put it along the hem. So similar to how we applied the lace along the waist is the same way that we're going to be doing it for the hem. We are going to be stitching through those inner corners. So that basting stitch that we did for our hem, we're going to be stitching through that. So you want the inner corners to be right on that basting stitch. So there may be a little bit of your lace trim kind of hanging off the edge of the top. That is kind of what we're going to be creating when we stitch it in place. And along the side, you want to open out your zipper. We're going to fold in a raw edge of the lace. You can either stitch this down by hand along the zipper, or you can stitch it by machine. I do think stitching it by hand will look better. I stitched it by machine in the tutorial, but I do recommend doing it by hand. But same way that we did for the top, you just want to stitch through the inner corners, making sure that the bottom goes onto that basting stitch, and then go ahead and do the same thing for the top. So as you can see here, I've just folded in the edge along the zipper. I'm going to place some clips just to hold that in place. And then I'm just going to make sure that I have the inner corners of that lace right along that basting stitch that we did for the hem of our top. Once you have it pinned, then we want to go ahead and stitch it in place. If you want to baste it in place, you absolutely can. But again, just make sure that you're stitching through the inner corners of the lace right along the basting stitch. We're going to do it for the lower edge as well as for the top edge. And then you can stitch down along the side of the zipper tape. Oh, again, I do recommend doing it by hand. All right, I have my lace sewn on and this is what that looks like. If you did apply any basting stitches, you can go ahead and remove all your basting stitches now from your top and then go ahead and give it one final press. Over here along the zipper opening, I do recommend that you kind of, just kind of make sure your lace matches up or just looks really nice and clean there. And it's even along that side. As you can see here, I did stitch mine in place for the tutorial, but I do think it will look better if I hand stitched it. That's just a recommendation. But I really do hope that you all have enjoyed this tutorial. You have just finished View C on McCall's M8530. Well, that is all for this tutorial, and I really do hope that it was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them down for me below. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Blessings, everyone. Bye.